sure that this is working. Oops. Should be the correct chapter. Make sure this is running. Great. Oh. Okay. Empire and Wars. So this is 1898 to 1918. So we're going to go through World War I at the end of this chapter, but we got a little bit before that. And this is a part of history that we don't often talk about, but I consider it one of my favorite parts. So, all right. So, to start out with this, the book mentions that the U.S. had mostly been focusing on heading west, obviously pushing out the Native Americans, taking resources from Western territories. Imperialism, for the most part, at least as far as like European nations were concerned, is like taking land that's not attached to your homeland, which is to say most of, if you want to think about imperialism, think about Britain, right? However, as we get towards the end of the 19th century, various factors, economic, social, cultural, etc., led many in America to believe that the country should begin to assert itself imperially because, well, we were becoming a major power. So between 1898 and 1904, which is a very short period of time, we acquired Guam, Hawaii, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. We created a protectorate in Cuba, which we'll talk more about later. We built a canal through Panama by exercising force. Also intervened in Haiti, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua. We got a lot done in a short period of time, and you can argue for a bit better or ill. Here we have, the 100-year difference. In 1798, we had the East Coast. Where's my mouse? Jesus. Here we go. The East Coast and to the Mississippi. And then 1798, you've got, of course, the continental U.S., Puerto Rico, and then these islands in the Pacific, Samoa Islands, Hawaii, and etc. Manila is the Philippines, or at least the capital of the Philippines. And then, of course, we have some various political cartoons of the day. Here we have Puck again. School begins. Uncle Sam in his class in civilization. Now, children, you must learn lessons whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you, and remember, in a little while, you will feel as glad as they are to be here. This is a representation of actually how schools were back in the day, where it was just all one big classroom, and the more advanced classes, or I guess the students that were ahead of the others, would sit in the back and typically would be learning on their own. The students in the front, which are to say these places that had been recently taken and are depicted in a very horrific racist way, would be learning directly from the teacher. Of course, Black Americans and Chinese Americans, as well as Native Americans, not even given that treatment, which is to say not even given the chance to be part of the large United States. Here we have Columbia's Easter bonnet, which is to say this world power imperialistic notion. Sort of the same thing again here with the various bits of land taken by the United States in, again, a pretty short period of time. This we'll get more into a little bit later. A thing well begun is half done. Finish the Canal, McKinley, and make our national expansion complete in your first administration. Well, McKinley didn't quite make it, obviously. We know McKinley ended up getting shot. But Teddy Roosevelt very much continues this, the whole Panama Canal thing. And then expansionism with the U.S., and then it says down here, a lesson for anti-expansionists, showing how Uncle Sam has been an expansionist first, last, and all the time, and how now all nations are anxious to be on friendly terms with Uncle Sam. Okay, and then some more stuff. Here's terrified Teddy Roosevelt ship. It says peace through, a massive navy. What images do I have on this? More Teddy Roosevelt, the new diplomacy, the world's constable. Now this is this? Oh no, what year is this? Let's see. Well, this goes to 1907 at least. Anyway, this shows just how far, using my laser pointer like you guys online can see that. So you've got Puerto Rico over here, Nicaragua, Panama, Cuba, etc. And then over here you've got Hawaii, which is about halfway across. But Manila is way over here. The Philippines are like just south of China. They're really far west, which was kind of the point. That was like a fueling station for further intervention in China, which we talked about. Oh no, I'm getting my other class mixed up. We talked about Opium Wars, in my European class. Anyway, so obviously, when it comes to why we're expanding, well, why are we getting into wars in the Middle East constantly? For money. There was factors of the economy. Now, it wasn't quite oil yet. So initially, we mostly exported agriculture, but of course, by the end of the 19th century, we were exporting a lot of finished industrial products. By 1870, let's see, exports totaled about 500 million. By 1905, it had tripled to 1.5 billion. So we had places like Rockefeller Standard Oil Company, Coca-Cola, Kodak, McCormick, etc. Were exporting to European and Asian markets. So while most of this did go to Europe, because Europe has nations similar to America, and they would be using a lot of these products, America wanted to open markets in Latin America and China because they had really large populations, and particularly China. Hawaii was kind of a testing ground for this. And a big part of what led the charge for these imperialistic economic ventures were actually missionaries. So in China, for example, missionaries would go in to convert the native populations, and while converting them to Christianity was part of it, it also would prepare these often tribal people for the American culture, I suppose, is the easiest way to put that. And if not American, at least like more Western, because European powers were doing the same thing. So while on paper it was, we're sending out, missionaries to help these non-Christians, like, yeah, okay, but also you're preparing them for the market to come in. Businessmen wanted to exploit the sugarcane market. In 1893, there were white plantation owners who worked with the American ambassadors, the ambassador and 150 Marines, overthrew the native government in Hawaii, overthrew Queen Liliuokalani, I believe is how that's pronounced, and just they took over the Hawaiian government. They tried to enter into an annexation agreement with the U.S., but President Grover Cleveland, who was, just constantly sitting on his hands about everything, also sat on his hands about this. So the white planters remained in charge and waited for another opportunity to become part of the United States. So I don't know how many people know about this, but Hawaii is probably one of the, I don't know if even saying it like that, I believe that Hawaii is like has the highest poverty rate out of any state in the U.S. because the native population is treated as second-class citizens. The native Hawaiians, they are all in squalor, and I guess another way to look at it, if you've ever seen Rio de Janeiro, where you've got the big fancy hotels and skyscrapers and resorts, and then there's like a wall, and on the other side are the favelas, the slums, essentially. That's how it is in Hawaii. You've got the big fancy hotels and resorts and stuff, and then hidden away where you can't see it are the slums where most of the people actually live. But, that's just how it goes when the businessmen are in charge. Anyway, Standard Oil, we know about this. Also, by the way, the reason they went with the name Standard Oil is back then oil refining was a pretty new process, so you weren't guaranteed to get oil that didn't have like chunks of stuff in it. So having a standard quality that you could trust was considered enough to literally name the brand after. So that's why it's Standard Oil. Coca-Cola again. We remember this. Oh yeah. I like this little thing. There is no game laws for those who hunt with a Kodak. The rod or gun may be left out, but no nature lover omits a Kodak from the camp outfit. Which is to say, there's certain seasons for hunting and fishing, but you can always go out and take pictures of nature. This is back when this was, the compact camera, which, to be fair, this is pretty compact compared to what they had before. It's still pretty large, but it could be folded away and made relatively portable. This is the McCormick Reaper that I was thinking about showing you guys before, where it was being pulled by horses. Obviously, there is kind of turned around on itself right now, but it's got the bits where it harvests, and then it goes on this little mill or a treadmill here, and it gets knocked into the collector. Now, this doesn't have the part that I showed you guys before with that the tractor had, where it also separates it and binds it, etc. But still, it does a lot more work than you'd be able to do by hand, a lot more quickly. There is Queen Liliuokalani, again, the last monarch of Hawaii, who was overthrown because some greedy white men wanted to exploit, the sugar cane market. So, as I said, there were various reasonings for this whole imperialism thing. Obviously, making money was the real reason. There were other arguments for this. Racial, of course. Americans, Western Europeans believe themselves as superior to non-whites in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and thus had a natural right of conquest. We can do it because we're better than them, and we deserve it, I guess. Now, eventually, just we're better than them and we can take their stuff wasn't quite good enough, so the argument became, oh, but we're helping them. We're taking everything that they have and basically enslaving them, but that's for their own good, right? The higher civilizations had a duty to uplift inferior peoples. Josiah Strong in Our Country proclaimed the Anglo-Saxon race was superior and should spread the blessings of the Christian way of life all over the world, because everyone else is inferior and backward, and yeah. Let's see. Obviously, as this is what I mentioned earlier with why the connection between economic aspirations and missionary work, John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Cyrus McCormick created the World Student Christian Federation, sent out 5,000 young missionaries across the world. A major target was China, where at least early on Christianity was illegal because it was seen as destroying the culture of the Chinese that they were converting. Because that was a major part of it, was you don't just convert to China, you don't just convert to Christianity, you have to give up all your old ways. By the 1920s, missionaries were running schools, hospitals, orphanages, leper colonies, churches, and seminaries to convert the backward Chinese to Christianity, the American way of life, which again means that if the Chinese are converted to the, quote, American way of life, they're more ready to consume American products. So this massive population is now ready to purchase American goods. So here is Josiah Strong, Our Country, Its Possible Future and Present Crisis, because, again, these things had long titles. Let's see. It's not necessary to argue that for those whom are right, that the two great needs of mankind, all men may be lifted into the light of the highest Christian civilization, are first, a pure spiritual Christianity, and second, a civil liberty. The Anglo-Saxon as the great representative of these two ideas, the depository of these two greatest blessings, sustains peculiar relations with the world's future, and divinely commissioned to be in a peculiar sense, his brother's keeper. Peculiar in this sense simply means like unique, not like strange. So yeah, this is literally like American exceptionalism, or really in this case, Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. So here is, I don't know what McCormick looks like, and I actually don't know what Rockefeller Jr. looks like either. So they might be in this picture, but this is an image I got when I looked up the World Student Christian Federation. And here we have another picture of this group. They are in in Tokyo Harbor, it seems. At least based on the life preserver here. And we've got a convent, again, probably in China. Although there were a lot of East Asian nations that were being infiltrated at this time. Again, same thing. Or this is definitely China based on the dress. Whoops. Okay. There are also these weird gender anxieties, because of course, that shaped how imperialism happened. So after the Civil War, America didn't really get involved in too many conflicts, which, to be fair, there weren't a whole lot of conflicts happening across the world. Europe had what was considered a long peace between, really even earlier than 1850s. They fought Napoleon in the 1810s, 1850 to 1815, I believe. And then after that, there was um, no real major wars in Europe. So Europe and America were both dealing with this time of peace that apparently was a problem. Yeah, many Americans felt that the next generation would not have a chance to test and strengthen their manhood because there weren't wars happening. Also, in the 1890s, there was the Depression, which we've already talked about. Men were unable to support their families. Now, the book mentions Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, that civilized white man had to take up the burden of spreading the light of civilization across the world. However, Kipling was a British poet, and most British poetry is sarcastic, or at least satire. Yeah, and in fact, like the book specifically says, the English writer Rudyard Kipling was a leading exponent of British imperialism. He's not. He wasn't. Yeah. So the book has the entire poem. It's not. It's 3 stanzas long. Let's see. I'll just read the first part. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Like, this isn't saying, oh, we're doing a great thing. It's you're sending your sons out to die, to enslave people that don't want us there. So I don't know. It's weird that the American history book, because obviously my European history book also talks about Kipling, because we cover the same era, and it specifically says that Kipling was a satirical beast. So I don't know. Also, as we've mentioned in previous chapters, women had an increasing importance during this era, and it made the men scared because, you know, anytime anybody but white men have any kind of power, the white men get scared. So we had Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was, I think he was the head of the Navy. Let's see. It just mentions him. I don't remember where if it says where his name is. Doesn't matter. He was concerned that if women got the right to vote, it would undermine military security because women were unwilling to use force. Yeah, okay. Now, when it came to imperial expansion, the biggest call came from these militarists who were known as jingoists. There was this English verse from 1878. We don't want to fight yet, by jingo, whatever the hell that means. If we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too. So that's where that term came from. In order to reassert their manhood, men should engage in warfare across the world. Roosevelt and Mahan both agreed with this. Mahan specifically said, no greater danger could befall civilization than the disappearance of the warlike spirit, and I dare say war, among civilized men. There are too many barbarians still in this world. So, yeah, nothing is more dangerous to civilization than the lack of war. Yeah, late 1800s were freaking weird, man. We had the Naval Act of 1890, authorized the construction of additional battleships, and within 10 years, the U.S. fleet had 17 battleships and 6 cruisers, which made it the 3rd most powerful navy in the world after, I believe, Britain and see, 1906. So, or sorry, 10 years, 1900. It wouldn't be Germany yet. It would probably be France. Either way, we were the third most powerful navy in the world, up from 12th in 1880. So we were doing pretty good for ourselves. Here we have the Judge magazine that is showing the supposed white man's burden of both England and America here, carrying the various peoples that they have conquered, all again being given a very racist art style, being carried over the rocks of barbarism, oppression, because we certainly weren't the ones oppressing them, ignorance, vice, superstition, brutality, etc., up to the light of civilization. Now that was the general mindset. Thankfully, I was able to find a different interpretation, where you have the white man's burden, where you have instead the colonies carrying the colonizers on their backs, because that's how colonies were treated. Colonies were there to be exploited, and their people were not treated well, which we will get to here in just a little bit. We also have this, because this idea of the white man's burden was so prevalent during the time that it was used for a soap ad. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through the virtues of cleanliness. Pear's soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. While amongst the cultured of all nations, it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. Toilet for basically everywhere but America just means the bathroom in general, not like the actual place you do your business. So it's bathroom soap, and it's being used as this weird metaphor for civilization. Someone must back up, so we've got this cart of progress, force if necessary, which we'll see a lot of. And here we have the Chinese dragon, 400 million barbarians, as they put it. We would get into that a little bit later as well. We'll talk about that in just a bit as well, with the whole Spain thing. Teddy Roosevelt in the Caribbean with the new fleet. And this was too good to not include. This is just a promotional image from Bioshock Infinite, which is a parody of this early American exceptionalism. But it's so not far off that I just decided I could include it. It is our holy duty to guard against the foreign hordes. And it's like, yeah, that's not far off. All right. Let's talk about Cuba. 1895. Cuba began its war for independence against Spain with this concept of Cubanidad, which is to say pride of nation. We're going back to this old idea of nationalism, where they're creating a nation around shared identity as opposed to whoever their leader is. Jose Marti, who was the main leader of this, believed liberation from Spain will give the impoverished peasants access to better land, also providing racial equality for the recently liberated Afro-Cuban population. we had a number of black Cubans like Antonio Maceo would flock to the rebellion and fill many high-ranking positions, which is going to be an issue for Americans later when we get involved. Now, the Cuban rebels had only about 50,000 troops, but they were really good at fighting the Spanish. Now, the Spanish had about 200,000 soldiers, so obviously they outnumbered the Cubans significantly. One major advantage the Cubans had, though, was disease, because Cuba is a tropical nation. It's in the Caribbean. It's mostly jungle. And the Spanish were not prepared for that kind of they weren't prepared for jungle fighting. No one's prepared for jungle fighting. And the Cubans who had been living there were prepared for the jungle fighting. So actually most of the Spanish deaths were from the tropical diseases. Also, when the Spanish tried to crack down on the rebels by like burning towns and stuff, it caused more people to join the rebellion. So it just made things worse for Spain. 1897, the Spanish government offered the rebels a series of reforms to allow home rule, which is to say Cuba would basically get independence, but they would still be part of the Spanish Empire. So like the easiest example for this is like with Canada, where Canada is technically its own country, but it's still part of the British Empire. Although I guess at this point it's a Commonwealth, but same idea. Canada's like, it's got the Queen on its money. However, Cuba was doing so well in this war against Spain, they decided they'd hold out to get total independence. They wanted full separation, or Cuba Libre, from Spain. And yeah, as I said, they could afford to have this level of confidence. A full quarter of Spanish troops, so a quarter of this 200,000, so as many Spanish troops as there were Cuban rebels died from disease. Yellow fever, malaria, and other tropical diseases. The chief military leader, General Maximo Gomez, said that his three best generals were Junio, Julio, and Augusto, which is to say June, July, and August, because that's when the rainy season started and the mosquitoes were at their worst, and the mosquitoes are the ones spreading the diseases. So when the diseases got the worst, the Spanish died in higher numbers. Let's see. Also, while we mostly talk about the Cuban War for Independence in this, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and African nations under Spanish rule were also rebelling at the same time. So these 200,000 Spanish troops were actually spread thin across these multiple fronts. Also, the people in Spain were getting very tired of this war, to the point that in January of 1898, the Spanish troops in Havana, which is the capital of Cuba, mutinied. They refused to follow orders from their commanders. So this would be like, I always use this as an example, this would be like if the British forces during the American Revolution in New York, which was more or less our capital at the time, and at least where all the British were, had just stopped listening to their commanders. Like, the war would have been over at that point. So the war was basically over at this point, and then we got involved. Anyway, here is some images of the Cuban forces absolutely kicking the crap out of the Spanish. Also, it reminds me of the joke I've seen where it's like um, Captain America only has one star on his outfit, so technically he's Captain Cuba. So there's an actual photograph of the rebels. Here, I believe, is a Spanish garrison surrendering to a group of the rebels. Because again, even the Spanish troops there were getting tired of the war. Now, this is when we start getting involved. Is we saw this, like the Spanish misrule was bad. However, we believe that once Spain was gone, it would actually be worse for Cuba because the rebels were somehow less able to rule Cuba than the Spanish, who had already been doing terribly, which we'll get into that in a minute. There's obviously all sorts of fun racism behind that. Yeah, so we have here the duty of the hour to save her not only from Spain, but from a worse fate. You know, from the people who are fighting for Cuban independence. Which, again, to use an analogy of 100 years ago at this point, it would be like if France, that helped us majorly in the American War for Independence, had been treating us as if, oh, well, if America wins its war for independence, they won't be able to rule themselves, so we're going to have to take over. Anyway, there were a number of reporters that showed up there before America got involved. What all do we have? Okay. And then we actually get to that. Right. So, again, the Cuban rebels were very close to winning it for themselves, and American policymakers felt like they needed to intervene to aid independence so that they would be able to have some level of control over post-war Cuba. Because Cuba was potentially able to make a lot of money, and we wanted part of that. That's what that's about. That's why Cuba hates us. Because we were always sticking our nose in their business. And this wouldn't be the last time. I mean, the whole reason all this stuff happened during the Cold War was because we couldn't just leave them alone. So the American press played a big role in this, not really focusing on the economics, but showing it as a matter of American honor. So we had William Randolph Hearst, who ran the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer, who ran the New York World, competed in providing American readers the most lurid coverage of Spanish atrocities. Sent reporters to Cuba to cover every story they could find, and if they couldn't find enough stories, they would make some up. They would just make up bad things that the Spanish did. This became known as yellow journalism and sparked this jingoistic outrage against Spain. So despite Spain being a European power, there was this weird racism against Spain. I don't know. There's the same thing against Germany later in World War I. FYI, the reason it was called yellow journalism was because, well, I say back then, but even today, my dad used to work at a paper mill. When paper's made, it's not white, not initially. It's usually kind of yellowish, because it's just made from wood pulp, and it's bleached to make it white before they print stuff on it. But you can buy the paper before it's bleached, and it's cheaper. So they would buy the paper more cheaply, so they could print the stuff out more quickly and not spend as much money. So when you went to the newsstand to see all the different newspapers, and there was these really rough-looking yellow papers over here, that was these atrocities going on in Cuba that may or may not be happening. And that's what became known as yellow journalism. Actually wasn't a weird racist thing about the Cubans or the Spanish. It was literally the color of the paper. So Hearst published a letter which had the Spanish minister in Washington calling McKinley weak, which made a lot of people upset. But the final straw came in February of 1898 when the battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 266 American sailors. New York World shouted the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Now, there's a couple of things about this. Obviously, it wouldn't make sense for Spain to actually attack an American ship, especially considering Spain was already losing against Cuba. And while the United States wasn't like the most powerful nation in the world, as we've seen at this point, we had the third most powerful navy. It was enough for us to blame Spain and get involved. Later investigations of the Maine wreckage show that the explosion came from inside the ship. And considering that back then the way the cannons were loaded, it was newer than sailing ship cannons where it was the powder and then the ball, but it still used loose powder, so there was still a room in the ship that was just loose gunpowder. And there were one of two things happened: either there was a static discharge that occurred, because sometimes that just happens. The atmosphere shifts and there's a static zap. Or, and this happened a lot, some idiot was smoking. And the ship blew up. But it was just easier to blame Spain because we all wanted to go to war with Spain. By April 21st, war was declared on Spain. However, very specifically, the proclamation stated that Cuba ought to be independent, but only when pacified. Not specifically when Spain was defeated, but this word is going to do a whole lot of heavy lifting here in a little bit. This image is, this is more about the Philippines. We'll get into that a little bit later. Here we have the Maine sailors murdered by Spain. The Spanish brute adds mutilation to murder. I don't know what that has. There wasn't Spanish sailors getting on the Maine and murdering the Americans. The ship blew up. At worst, the ship maybe hit a mine, but that wasn't. The Spanish didn't torpedo it. Also, why were we in Havana Harbor if we weren't at war with? Yeah. Also, we got involved in Guam, but that one we don't talk as much about. Here we have Pulitzer and Hearst wearing. Also, by the way, this was a normal thing back then. Baby clothes weren't really a thing yet, or at least those that were. It's fairly expensive to buy clothes for a child that's going to grow out of them in 2 months. So what a lot of people did is they would just take newspapers and wrap their children in them as sort of a little, as you can see here, a little dress. And since the yellow journalism newspapers were the cheapest, that became a common sight. So this political cartoon is showing both Pulitzer and Hearst in their own little yellow journalism baby dresses, arguing over who gets to be the one to start the war. So here we have the last blow. No longer will brutal Spain be supported by outraged colonies. We're, of course, nothing about America and the colonies we're going to get from this. This is an old pin from Then to hell with Spain, remember the Maine. Think about it. Yeah, there's a picture of the Maine exploding. And Uncle Sam punching Spain in the mouth. It's not a great place to punch somebody, but alright. Now there is an actual photograph of like the remains. The ship was completely destroyed. But again, like later, at least to my memory of things that I've seen about it, later investigations did show that the explosion came from inside the ship, and it's pretty likely it came from the powder room. So unless like a Spanish sailor swam out to the ship and got on there somehow without anybody noticing and like went into the room and blew himself up in the powder room, it was probably an accident. That sort of thing just happened. But it was too late. Peace in Cuba under Spanish rule, worse than hell. Alright, War of 1898. So going to war with Spain was what the imperialists wanted. And also, after the war began, McKinley began working on the annexation of Hawaii, which we had talked about earlier, that Grover Cleveland didn't do because Cleveland was too busy messing up everything else. It was good, as we mentioned, that the Cuban rebels had done most of the work because we didn't really have much of a standing army. We could only muster about 30,000 men, and while McKinley did mobilize about 200,000 National Guard troops, and as we mentioned, Roosevelt resigned and created his Rough Riders Regiment, we weren't ready for this war. We were not prepared for fighting in Cuba. We were like the Spanish, didn't have the experience, inadequate supplies. We're not suited for the hot, humid environment, and once again, not immune to the tropical diseases. Also, because America, there was an issue of racial tensions, because obviously, the book here specifically says, let's see, as more black troops arrived in southern ports for deployment in Cuba, they faced increasingly hostile crowds, angered at the presence of armed African men in uniform. In Tampa, Florida, where troops gathered from all over the country to be transported to Cuba, racial tensions exploded on the afternoon of June 8th. Intoxicated white soldiers from Ohio, nothing that good ever comes from Ohio, grabbed a 2-year-old black boy from his mother and used him for target practice, shooting a bullet through his shirt sleeve. In retaliation, African-American soldiers stormed into the streets and exchanged gunfire with whites, leaving 3 whites and 27 black soldiers wounded. Reporting on the story of this riot, the Atlanta Constitution denounced the, quote, wild and demonic conduct of the Negro regulars, because, of course, completely ignoring the behavior of the white troops that had prompted the whole thing. Of course, when it actually came to the war, the black troops went on to distinguish themselves on Cuban battlefields because racism's made up. So despite all the trouble, the war was only 4 months long. 460 Americans died in combat, and we lost more than 5,000 due to disease. Because again, we weren't ready for the tropical climate. Secretary of State John Hay called the hostilities a splendid little war. Spain also ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S. and recognized the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, which we'll get into in just a minute, which is a whole separate thing. Excuse me. So here we have Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill. I love how you've got guys down here cheering, guy up here getting a bullet. These large images are always real weird. Again, got the American troops storming. I believe this is San Juan Hill again, because I'm pretty sure this is Roosevelt. And there again we have the black regulars, who, of course, their regiments were segregated. And I have this one from before, where the American flag has not been planted on foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake, which, yeah, we'll get to that in just a moment. Holding his end up, John Bull, which is the personification of Britain. It's really most extraordinary what training will do. Why, only the other day I thought the man unable to support himself. So here is America with, let's see, the Philippines, Lardon Islands, that's some islands of the Pacific. They're different names now. Puerto Rico, Cuba, in the middle there's Hawaii, all of course, real horrific racial caricatures. But speaking of Cuba, things didn't end there. So America adopted the Teller Amendment before the war had truly began, where we would aid Cuban independence, but only after, quote, pacification. So due to the aforementioned racial prejudice, Americans in general, were blind to how much the Cuban rebels had actually worked in the fight for their independence, which, again, as we'd said, was most of it. Commanding officers who arrived in Cuba were shocked at the number of blacks in leadership positions. For example, one U.S. officer reported to the New York Times, the typical Cuban, and this is him talking about the people we were going to help, not the Spanish we had just been spending all that time talking shit about. The typical Cuban I encountered was a treacherous, lying, cowardly, thieving, worthless half-breed mongrel, born of a mongrel spawn of Spain, crossed upon the fetches of darkest Africa and aboriginal America. Like, damn. That was a lot of really racist shit in 3 lines. So obviously, U.S. officials felt that Cuba was unfit for self-rule. It remained under occupation until 1902, when Cuba was basically forced to adopt a governing document that was based on the Constitution. But it also has strings attached. The Platt Amendment, limited Cuban sovereignty, prohibited Cuba from signing foreign treaties without U.S. consent. America could intervene in Cuba to preserve independence and remove threats to economic stability, and also lease Guantanamo Bay to the U.S. as a naval base. So this is why we have Guantanamo Bay. So yeah, the occupation ended in 1901. However, Cuba remained a protectorate, which is to say, we could do whatever we wanted in Cuba. We treated it like a child. I mean, I'll literally have an image about that in just a moment, where they could not take care of themselves because they were inferior. Which again, it would be like if France had done that to us in our war. Like, they helped us defeat, which they did more for us than we did for Cuba. But they helped us defeat Britain, and then oh, by the way, you guys clearly can't handle yourselves, so we're going to basically take you over and sort of give you independent rule, but you have to go through us for everything. So here are American troops, American Army of Occupation entering Havana, which again is the capital of Cuba. We were just another occupying army after Spain was defeated. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippine Islands, Sandwich Islands, etc. This is, again, just a sort of imperialistic expansion of America. Is another real weird Taft thing, but the policies of Roosevelt. Here we go. This is what I was thinking about. The first steps alone. So you've got Cuba as this child, but with the protectorate thing around its waist, and America watching on as like this protective maternal figure. It's like they were the ones who were doing all the fighting for their own independence. Like, how it's insulting is the nicest word I can think of. Yeah, and that's how we would continue to treat like most of Central and South America in the oncoming several decades. Prosperity at home, prestige abroad, commerce, civilization, etc. Here we go again. Save me from my friends. This is the same sort of like, we have to go to Cuba to save Cuba from itself. All right. I've got to talk about the Philippines. We've got 10 minutes left. I got to talk about the Philippines. So, before we had even invaded Cuba, the United States had sent a fleet to the Philippines. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, under the command of Commodore George Dewey, had attacked and destroyed the Spanish flotilla in Manila Bay on May 1st, killing nearly 400 Spanish sailors and leaving only 8 Americans with minor injuries. I don't know how you managed that. I mean, like, did the cannons get too hot and they had to go sit down? Did they maybe get a little salt water in their face? Like, that is a hell of a difference in a naval battle, because typically in a naval battle you either are fine or you get murdered, because you're shooting each other with big cannons. 2.5 months later, American forces invaded Manila, and the Spanish forces just surrendered because there wasn't any point in fighting back. So immediately, imperialists wanted to annex the Philippines as a staging post for future economic exploitation of China, because if you're not familiar, the Philippines are like directly south of China. I had a map earlier of, they just called it Manila, but that's like the capital of the Philippines. And it is like right below China. It is way across the Pacific. Of course, though, when it came to what we should do with the people living in the Philippines, lots of racial reasoning. That the Filipino people could not govern themselves, that it was, our duty to go in and take over. Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge stated, "We should never forget that in dealing with the Filipinos, we deal with children." Now, there was actually a little bit of pushback from within the United States. Had individuals like Andrew Carnegie, Jane Addams, Mark Twain, and labor organizers like Samuel Gompers, who we will never speak of again, who created an anti-imperialist league. Now, the league had a lot of different reasonings for not wanting imperialist expansion from America. For example, America shouldn't be imperialist because that was like the whole thing behind our creation, as we were fighting against an empire. Also economic concerns, which was like Carnegie's whole thing. Carnegie doesn't care about humans. He cares about the economics. Also, the Filipinos themselves were not exactly happy with us being there. They fought back against occupying forces, which resulted in mass atrocities. About 200,000 Filipino civilians died between 1899 and 1902. But by July of 1901, the Philippine Islands were technically an American holding. But the the fighting didn't end until like 1913. This war, this conflict, was our longest conflict until like Afghanistan. So this is the very short fight in Manila Bay. And then us going in and murdering the Filipinos for their own good. The Senate Philippine bill offers great inducements to the bad Filipino, because, the good Filipino are civilized and doing what we want, and the bad Filipino are basically cavemen. We also had a lot of mass graves where we would just dump people that we had killed, be they actual insurrectionists or civilians. They're all the same to us. We also had lots of fun torture techniques. This was known as the water cure. It's basically waterboarding, but without the cloth. We just dump water down their throats. Here we have a violent outbreak at Tonda, in which the Tagals, which is a group of the Filipinos, made a fierce and sudden onslaught upon the Americans. They were repulsed with great slaughter. In one yard of which a photograph was taken, there was found at least 20 dead. Basically, they jumped the fence with, swords, and the Americans had machine guns. And here is a garrote execution device, where they would slowly tighten it until the person was killed. It wasn't even like where you hang them and it's supposed to kill them immediately. Like, this was meant to be a slow execution. But we're the good guys. Ah, yes, here we are. Lucky Filipinos. It appears the Filipinos have lost confidence in Americans. Do the benighted wretches fail to realize what we have accomplished on their islands? We may have burned certain villages, destroyed considerable property, and incidentally slaughtered a few thousand of their sons and brothers, husbands and fathers, etc. But what did they expect? Were we to transport an army more than halfway across around the earth? Yeah. Merely to listen to peace proposals? Not much. And look at Manila. 2 years ago, the main street of Manila did not possess a single saloon. Now there are 13 on this one street. And they complain that drunken American soldiers insult the native women. Insult was a euphemism for assault, I should say. What do they expect from a drunken soldier anyway? Progress is now on the islands. She may be red-handed and at times drunk, but she is there for business. So yeah, that was our stuff with Cuba. And actually, real quick, I'm going to see, there's a video I want to show, and obviously I can't show my online class, so I'll post the link for that. So I will get back to you guys next week.